Battle of the Granicus, 334 BC. As Alexander prepared to cross the Granicus River, the Persian forces lined the opposite bank, ready to defend their territory fiercely. Despite warnings from his generals, Alexander insisted on launching a direct attack, leading the charge across the river with his companion cavalry. In the heat of the battle, he was targeted by Persian nobles. Just as one Persian soldier raised his weapon to strike a fatal blow, Cletus the Black intervened, saving Alexander's life. This daring moment not only secured Alexander's first major victory, but also set the tone for his audacious campaigns throughout Asia. Siege of Tyre, 332 BC. The Siege of Tyre lasted 7 months, testing Alexander's patience and engineering skills. Tyre, an island fortress, seemed impenetrable, but Alexander ordered the construction of a massive causeway to connect it to the mainland. When the final assault began, Alexander personally led his troops over the newly built path amidst a hail of arrows and stones. Despite the Tyrians' desperate resistance, the city was eventually breached. The brutality of the battle was matched by the merciless aftermath, with thousands of Tyrians killed or enslaved, marking one of the most ruthless episodes of Alexander's conquests.
Hi, I am Dr. David Santos, and welcome back to our study on ancient Mediterranean history. This is a fun week because this is the week we jump into the life of Alexander the Great and see how he is a transitional period from the dominance of the Greek civilization and moving into the Hellenistic era, and seeing how he conquered and what changes he makes and how he really spreads Hellenism throughout the Mediterranean world. So as we get started here, so we can get a quick overview of Alexander. He's born somewhere around 356 and dies in 323 BC. So he's the Macedonian king who reshapes the ancient world through his conquest from Greece all the way to India. Then he got to India, looked around, realized they had elephants, and decided maybe we don't need the entire world, just really the world we care about. So from there, he pulls back to Babylon. So the context here is his campaigns marked the transition from the classical Greek world to the Hellenistic age, creating a blend of Greek and Eastern cultures. So important for us to understand is always the historiography, and in this case, the historiography of Alexander has some pretty good ancient sources, but for them to be relevant to us and first interpret them accurately, we need to be aware of where they're coming from. So Arrian is probably the most well-known. He's generally viewed as the most reliable, focusing on military and strategic aspects of Alexander's campaigns. So another one we have is Plutarch. You've probably heard that name a number of times. I know you have, if you've been watching all of his lectures, you've seen Plutarch a number of times. And he provides this moralistic and philosophical exploration of Alexander's character, and he emphasizes these virtues and vices. So we can see where these two guys, Arrian and Plutarch, are coming from things from very different perspectives. And Curtius Rufus, he offers a moral, critical view, examining really kind of the dark aspects of Alexander's ambition and its conquests, and its consequences. And the challenges of the ancient historiography, couple points here. Many ancient sources were either contemporaries or direct followers of Alexander. So how these are often interpreted is they are interpreted as being biased, and they're biased, or the other way that they're considered is they're exaggerated. And we do know that the ancient authors did tend to make exaggerations, especially when they were the winners. So they would definitely exaggerate these things. We see it all through ancient culture. And the other problem we have is that there's a loss of primary sources like Ptolemy's and Aristobulus, their accounts that really complicates the reconstruction of Alexander's life. So, background in education, he's born in Pella in Macedonia. He's the son of Philip, and he has a great education. He's tutored by Aristotle, who instilled in him this love for especially these Homeric ideals in Greek culture. So Alexander is said to have traveled with a copy of the Iliad. He had especially a tremendous appreciation for the Iliad and several of the characters there, but especially Achilles, but also others, Agamemnon and others from those stories. But he loved the idea, according to these sources, of the stereotypical Greek half-god, half-man idea. He loved the idea of the significant and powerful leader who was fierce in battle, who was bold and brave and had no fear, or at least exhibited no outward signs of having fear. So you take that and you blend that with the influence of Philip, and Philip sort of lays this groundwork for the Macedonian military supremacy with reforms like the Sarissa armed phalanx. So Philip's death in 336 led to Alexander's ascension. So while there were suspicions even that Alexander may have been involved in his father's assassination, there's really no evidence to support that claim, but it is something that is discussed. So key historiographical notes are that ancient sources such as Diodorus and Plutarch, they emphasize Alexander's education, valor, ambition, often portraying him as a divine hero destined for greatness. That's how Alexander wished to be portrayed as well. So early campaigns and consolidation of powers where we're going to start. So within the first area, securing Macedonia and Greece, this is 336, 335 BC. So Alexander was able to really quickly secure Macedonia, and he suppressed Greek revolts, notably sacking Thebes to assert dominance over the Greek city-states. And remember from previous lectures, Thebes has become one of the major powers in Greece. So coming against them early on would be really important. He established the League of Corinth, and that really positioned him as having hegemony of Greece and setting the stage for his Persian campaign. So another historiographical note here. So Arrian's Anabasis provides a detailed account of these campaigns, and it's based on Ptolemy and Aristobulus, often highlighting Alexander's strategic acumen and leadership. And Rufus, however, portrays Alexander as ruthless, and he emphasizes the sacking of Thebes as evidence of his cruelty. So I guess what it comes down to is how do you want to look at these sources, who should be believed, and really get the idea of what would the people of his time really think about Alexander. And I have this feeling that both things can be true at the same time. Yes, he is ruthless. He is trying to gain control of the world. At the same time, he can be seen as a virtuous king and leader of men into battle. So I don't see those things as necessarily having to be in contrast. They can both be accurate. So I want to share with you this story of Alexander at Delphi, one of these very famous accounts of Alexander, who is extremely superstitious. So here is that story.
The story of Alexander the Great at the Oracle of Delphi is a fascinating moment in his early reign, filled with drama and hints of divine destiny. In 336 BC, after becoming king of Macedonia, Alexander was preparing for his ambitious campaign against the Persian Empire. Before launching this military expedition, Alexander sought guidance from the Oracle of Delphi, one of the most renowned religious centers in Greece. The oracle was believed to offer divine counsel, especially in matters of great significance. Alexander arrived at Delphi in the winter of 336-335 BC. However, according to tradition, Pythia, the priestess of Apollo who delivered the oracle's prophecies, was only available to give prophecies on certain days of the year, typically during the warmer months. Since Alexander arrived during the off-season, the Pythia initially refused to conduct the ritual. Undeterred by the priestess's refusal, Alexander was determined to receive Apollo's divine blessing. According to legend, he physically dragged the Pythia to the temple, demanding that she provide him with a prophecy. As he pulled her toward the temple, she exclaimed, "My son, you are invincible." Hearing these words, Alexander took them as the prophecy he had sought. In his mind, it was a clear divine endorsement of his military campaign against the Persian Empire. Satisfied, he interpreted the Pythia's words as confirmation that he was destined to conquer and that his campaign would be blessed by the gods. This episode showcases several aspects of Alexander's character. His ambition. Alexander was not easily deterred, even by religious protocol. His belief in destiny. He saw himself as divinely appointed, and this moment at Delphi reinforced his sense of invincibility. His determination. The event illustrates his forceful will and belief in his divine mission, traits that would define his conquest and rulership. The story blends the historical and the legendary, emphasizing Alexander's exceptional boldness and self-assuredness, traits that marked his subsequent campaigns across the Persian Empire and beyond.
All right, so Alexander at Delphi, definitely an important account for us to understand. And it helps us understand who Alexander was. He's, like I said, as we enter the story, a very superstitious man, but also a man that appreciated Greek antiquity. So he likes these Greek stories, and he loves the idea of Greek prophecy. Now, I do want to encourage you to look up the article by Dr. John Hale that talks about the archaeology and background to Delphi. It's interesting to look at the literature for many, many decades and kind of generation after generation of archaeology and history. Greek historians and archaeologists saw Delphi as a real place and believed that it actually existed and that the stories about it were true. On the other hand, if you weren't from Greece, you may have thought that Delphi was just a story or a legend. It's interesting to look at Dr. Hale's article, and he met up with a geologist, and they found the location, and they found these fissures in the ground. I'll give you the rough summary of it. You can definitely look it up. Just do an internet search for Delphi and Dr. John Hale, and it should come up. What they found was a very unique location and they researched the vapors that would have been coming out of the ground and put all these things together, and scientifically were able to make the argument that those stories from Delphi were actual, at least rooted in actual accounts, and it was probably these vapors that came up and put these people into a trance kind of a state. And what would happen is they would suspend this woman up above this cross section of these fissures, and as they'd be suspended, the vapors would come up. They would inhale these vapors, and the vapors would put them in this transcendental state, and they would spew out these prophecies, and then the main priestess would come in and interpret those prophecies. So, very interesting background. Really interesting to me to see someone going out and finding the location and putting the pieces of the puzzle together. So as we move on to the Persian campaign, so 334 to 330 BC, we get the first key event is the crossing of the Hellespont. So Alexander, he begins his invasion of the Persian Empire. He crosses into Asia Minor, and he defeats the Persian satraps at the Battle of Granicus. Key battles here: Battle of Issus. That's where Alexander defeated Darius III, and Darius flees. And when he takes off, he actually leaves his family behind. And Alexander is able to capture them and use them as bargaining ships later. But here he is. Alexander has Darius's entire family. There's more details to that we won't go into. But just one of these crazy stories from history. And perhaps in future times we'll get to tell the story in more greater detail. The Siege of Tyre. This successful siege secured the eastern Mediterranean coast for Alexander. That was one of Alexander's key strategies, was to really capture territory that allowed him to maintain his supply lines and not have to worry about being outflanked or having enemy troops come up behind him, or not even necessarily enemy Persian troops, but having some kind of revolt from capture areas that he's already captured. So he was careful in how he took this approach. Even going to Egypt, and there's this conquest of Egypt, and it's 332, 331 BC, and that's Alexander was declared pharaoh and founded the city of Alexandria. And Alexandria is going to be a very important city all through the Hellenistic period and even on into the Roman period. Alexandria becomes an area of great wealth, and you're going to see populations of all kinds be going to Alexandria. So we see Greeks there, we see Romans there, we see a gigantic Jewish population there, and that's true even in, say, 70 AD when the Jewish temple is destroyed. There's a Jewish population there. So a couple historiographical points. Callisthenes, he's an early historian, and he produces propaganda for Alexander. At least that's the way it's interpreted. And he portrays these victories as divine vindication of Alexander's mission to rule all of Asia. So we have a contrasting guy, Nericus, and what he does, he provides more of a practical account, focusing on the logistical and naval challenges faced by Alexander's army. So as these things go about, Alexander's going to come up against a number of additional rulers and kingdoms, and there is this story about Alexander's visit to Jerusalem. And I just want to share this story with you. And it kind of has the earmark of being true. It also kind of has the earmark of being somewhat exaggerated or apocryphal. But I think it's a great account. And here it is for you.
The story of Alexander the Great's visit to Jerusalem is a legendary tale that blends history and Jewish tradition. While there are no direct historical records confirming this event from Alexander's own chroniclers, it is preserved in later Jewish sources, notably the Antiquities of the Jews by Flavius Josephus, written in the 1st century AD. After defeating the Persian king Darius III at the Battle of Issus in 333 BC, Alexander continued his campaign southward toward Egypt. On the way, he conquered the coastal cities of the Levant, including Tyre and Gaza, which were key Persian strongholds. According to Josephus, while Alexander was still besieging Tyre, he sent a demand to the Jewish high priest, requesting supplies and allegiance. However, the high priest, named Jaddua, refused, stating that he had already pledged allegiance to Darius III of Persia. Alexander was reportedly angered by this refusal, but was focused on his siege of Tyre. After Tyre fell, Alexander marched toward Jerusalem. The Jews were understandably fearful, anticipating that Alexander would attack them as punishment for their disobedience. As Alexander approached Jerusalem, something unexpected happened. The high priest, accompanied by other priests and citizens dressed in white, went out to meet Alexander in a solemn procession. According to Josephus, Jaddua wore his full priestly garments, including the high priest's mitre with a golden plate bearing the sacred name of God. When Alexander saw the high priest, he did something astonishing. He dismounted from his horse and bowed before him. Alexander's companions were shocked and asked why he, the king of the world, would bow to a Jewish priest. Alexander explained that, before embarking on his campaign, he had a dream in which he saw a man dressed exactly like the high priest, who assured him that he would be victorious over the Persians. Seeing the high priest now, Alexander believed this was the man from his dream. Impressed by the encounter, Alexander did not harm Jerusalem. Instead, he entered the city peacefully. The Jewish sources further state that Alexander offered sacrifices to God in the temple and even granted the Jews special privileges, including exemption from paying tribute in the sabbatical year when the land was to lie fallow. Jewish tradition also associates Alexander's visit with the prophecies in the book of Daniel, which are interpreted as foretelling the rise of the Greek Empire and Alexander's conquest. According to Josephus, the high priest showed Alexander these prophecies, further convincing him that his campaign was divinely ordained. This story emphasizes several key themes. Divine providence, Alexander's vision, and the high priest's peaceful approach highlight the role of divine intervention and the prophetic destiny in his campaign. Alexander's diplomacy. It demonstrates Alexander's willingness to adapt and engage with local traditions and religious figures. Jewish-Greek relations. It portrays Alexander as a figure who, despite his conquests, could respect the traditions and faith of the peoples he encountered. Whether historical or legendary, the story reflects the complex interactions between Alexander the Great and the diverse cultures he encountered during his conquest.
All right, so great story about Alexander's visit to Jerusalem. And one of the main sources that comes from is Josephus. So really an important story for us to grab hold of and have a good understanding of. And the next thing I want to share with you is just this Battle of Granicus in 334 BC. And here it is for you.
The Battle of the Granicus, 334 BC, is a prime example of Alexander winning through sheer willpower and superior horsemanship. Here's the story. When Alexander launched his first major campaign against the Persian Empire, he faced a formidable force of Persian satraps and Greek mercenaries positioned across the Granicus River in Asia Minor. The Persian troops were confident that the fast-flowing river and steep banks would slow the Macedonians, making an assault nearly impossible. However, Alexander, refusing to be deterred, decided to launch an aggressive attack despite the river's strong currents and the exposed approach. Riding his famous horse Bucephalus, Alexander personally led the charge with his companion cavalry. He spurred his troops forward, shouting encouragement and setting an example of fearless determination. The cavalry plunged into the river, facing a barrage of arrows and spears from the Persian line on the other side. As Alexander emerged on the opposite bank, his horse climbed the slippery embankment and he charged directly at the Persian commanders, specifically targeting the leadership to break their morale. His horsemanship was excellent, as he maneuvered Bucephalus skillfully across rough terrain, using the horse's agility to evade attacks and press forward. In the heat of the battle, Alexander reportedly had his helmet knocked off by a Persian noble named Rosatius, who attempted to strike Alexander down. But before the enemy could deliver a fatal blow, Alexander countered with a swift strike, slaying him. Alexander's relentless offensive and his inspiring presence shattered the Persian ranks, turning what seemed like a desperate gamble into a decisive victory. His boldness and mastery of cavalry tactics not only secured the Granicus crossing, but also set the tone for his rapid and relentless conquest of the Persian Empire.
All right, so that's the Battle of Granicus. And from there, we can start to see really the central portion of the Persian Empire and the rise of Alexander. So one of the key battles in this era is the Battle of Gaugamela, and that's where Alexander decisively defeats Darius III, and that's when he also establishes control over the Persian heartland, and this leads to the capture of Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis. So a historiographical point here is Arrian and Plutarch emphasize Alexander's strategic brilliance and daringness, and Rufus critiques his growing despotism and opulence. So you have very differing views in this case. And we get the pursuit and death of Darius in 330. Here, Alexander's pursued Darius across the empire. He eventually finds him dead, murdered by his own men. So it's this point that marks Alexander as the undisputed ruler of the Persian Empire. So we get a little bit of analysis here where historians like Arrian see this as a culmination of his victory. It's a completion of Alexander's ambition to become the ruler of Asia, while others, like Diodorus, they view this as the start of his moral decline. And again, I could see both of these things being true. So, share with you here that the Battle of Gaugamela, and this is one of those important accounts. We have a few here, but here's the Battle of Gaugamela. So in this one, the Battle of Gaugamela it's fought in 331 BC, and it marked the victory of Alexander the Great over the Persian king Darius. And in this battle, even despite being heavily outnumbered, Alexander's tactical ingenuity and disciplined forces, they were able to overwhelm the Persian army. He used an oblique attack strategy, and in this case, he creates gaps in the Persian lines, and he exploited those gaps with cavalry charges, and Darius fled the battlefield in this case, leading to the collapse in Persian morale. And this really paves the way for Alexander's conquest of the Persian Empire. So important one for us to be aware of. So we've seen the completion of the campaign, the death of Darius, and now we get to these campaigns in Central Asia and India, 329 to 325 BC. And there's a consolidation, and Alexander faced fierce resistance, leading to brutal reprisals and mass marriages to integrate Macedonian Persian elites. The campaign in India culminated in the Battle of Hydaspes, and it's against King Porus, one of Alexander's most challenging battles. Here, the historiography is important as well. We see it. We see these embellished accounts presenting Alexander as a philosopher king, which would be hearkening back to the days of the philosopher Pluto and even Socrates, but these ideas of philosopher kings that are both able to conquer, but also being wise in how they rule the land. While we see that, we also see Arrian's account, which is comprehensive, but leans heavily on Alexander's logistical challenges and evolving strategies, and portraying him as both conqueror and a visionary. So within this broader idea of looking at various battles, here we see the siege of Malian in 325. Another one where we see Alexander's boldness, and as the accounts portray him, he's seen as undefeatable, and it's one of the more interesting accounts. So here it is for you.
The siege of the Malian city in 325 BC. Here's the story. While besieging the city of the Malians in the Punjab region, Alexander, known for his recklessness and personal bravery, led the assault by scaling the city walls ahead of his men. Impatient with the slow progress, he leaped over the wall into the inner fort, accompanied only by a few bodyguards. His troops, stunned by his audacity, struggled to follow him, leaving Alexander momentarily isolated within the city walls. Inside, Alexander found himself surrounded by Malian warriors. During the desperate combat that followed, he was struck by an arrow that pierced his chest and shoulder area, narrowly missing his lung. According to some sources, the arrow struck near the head or neck, depending on the interpretation of the ancient accounts. Severely wounded and bleeding profusely, Alexander collapsed but continued to fight off his attackers, using his shield as protection. His soldiers, finally breaching the walls, found Alexander critically injured but alive. They carried him out of the city, fearing he might not survive the wound. The injury was so severe that rumors spread among the troops of his death, nearly causing panic in the ranks. However, after being treated by his physicians, Alexander recovered, although slowly. His recovery boosted the morale of his men, who were in awe of their leader's bravery, but also alarmed by his recklessness. This incident is often cited as a prime example of Alexander's fearless but impulsive nature, demonstrating both his heroism and the perilous consequences of his aggressive leadership style.
All right, so we're headed towards the end. Here we have the decline and death of Alexander, 323 BC. So we see first a mutiny and retreat. Alexander's troops, they're exhausted. They've been doing battle for years. They've been on the campaign trail. They mutinied at the Hyphasis River, forcing him to turn back. And he returns to Babylon. And at Babylon, he began planning further conquest, but he falls ill and he dies in 323 BC. So here's where we need to look at the historiography and see ancient sources debate the causes of Alexander's death, ranging from poison to fever. So Plutarch and Arrian, they highlight Alexander's unresolved plans for future conquests, suggesting a sense of divine mission that was cut short. So most of the time, I think you're actually going to hear of Alexander of simply, you may have heard the somewhat apocryphal story of Alexander lamenting, crying out that there's nothing left for him to conquer. And as he does this outside in the rainstorm, that's what brings on his illness and causes him to fall to a fever. And in this fever, he dies. Today, I tend to lean towards assassination for some reason. Maybe perhaps a general that was tired of doing the campaign Alexander's way and ready to move on. But that's the debate. That's to be considered another time. So modern perspectives on Alexander. So we've had these scholarly shifts. Modern historians tend to have critiqued Alexander's legacy and portray him as a ruthless imperialist rather than an enlightened conqueror. And there are these revisionist approaches where recent studies emphasize the cultural and economic transformation initiated by Alexander's campaigns and focusing on the spread of Hellenistic culture and synchronism. So the idea of spreading the culture that he appreciated is really important to us to understand. So he did this for the purpose of having a unified empire, but he wants them unified with a unification that's based on his own culture, which he appreciated so much. So he's trying to bring folks into the Greek Hellenistic fold. So our conclusions here are that there is a legacy, an interpretation of that legacy. Alexander's legacy remains contested, with interpretations ranging from heroic conqueror to despotic tyrant. Like I've said, I think both things can be true at the same time. His campaigns laid the foundation for the Hellenistic world and influenced Roman, medieval, and modern perceptions of leadership and empire. So I don't want to just leave you with that. I want to conclude with just a couple stories here for you to consider as we leave our study of Alexander.
Mutiny at the Hyphasis River, 326 BC. Alexander stood before his exhausted troops on the banks of the Hyphasis River, urging them to march further into India. But his men, worn out after years of relentless campaigning, refused to advance. Alexander, furious and disappointed, retreated to his tent in silence. The following day, he emerged and declared a grand sacrifice and games in honor of their decision to return home. This episode was not only a turning point in his campaign, but also a humbling reminder of the limits of ambition, even for the son of Zeus. Death in Babylon, 323 BC. In the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, Alexander lay feverish and delirious, surrounded by his generals. His voice was weak as he reportedly passed his signet ring to Perdiccas, hinting at succession plans that would never be clear. When asked who should succeed him, Alexander's ambiguous response, "to the strongest," sowed chaos and division among his generals. As the conqueror of the known world slipped into silence, the empire he built began to fracture, leaving a legacy that would shape history for centuries to come.